series. Just to those who don't know, this is the loft of David Silver and Freya Burke and Eli, their son, 5 months old, who you'll see periodically transversing back and forth, who have kindly let us use the space since it's getting to be too big to comfortably use our offices. This is the first in the 3 series for the spring. I assume most of you have flyers, but the next 2 are planned for April 23rd, which will be a general introduction to the work of Wilhelm Reich and placing it in the context of his life, which we've done before. I haven't done it for a while, so if you know anyone who's interested in a good general introduction, that's a very good one. And the last one for the spring series will be on May 16th, and that is a very fortuitous event. For those of you who know that Dr. Sobey was planning to do a 4th lecture in this series. He had done 3, and traditionally before each one, he said that was the last one, and then he would have a good time giving the lecture, and then he said he'll do one more. And he was supposed to do a 4th before he died. I thought that was the end of it, but going through some papers, I found his notes for, or actually a little essay that he was preparing for that lecture. And so based on that, we'll do a presentation around his work on the emotional play, Dr. Reich's concept of emotional play, and then we'll finish with that with a phone hookup, as we did last time with the cancer biopsy, to Seattle with Dr. Rothenberg, who was probably one of the last, one of the 2 or 3 last who were there at Dr. Reich's meetings convened to discuss the emotional play. So we'll have a chance to draw on his first-hand experience. So that's what's coming, and then again we'll have another one coming in the fall. So today I'm going to do a presentation on essentially orgone therapy and its relationship to what's presented often and usually as Reichian therapies. And I decided that it was a good opportunity both to discuss what the basic premises of orgone therapy are as opposed to other kinds of treatment, to re-emphasize some of that, but also to point out what and how Reich's work has been both watered down and fragmented and redirected, some of it to a positive result, others to problematic results. But part of what's going on is that there's a great tendency not to know much about what the real nature of orgone therapy is, and to assume that orgone therapy is just a Reichian therapy, and Reich would have been very distressed. Although we must say, Dr. Sobey always quoted Reich, and you can find it in Reich's writings, where he talks about the fact that he predicts that as soon as he dies, his work will be picked apart, and different pieces of it will be used to justify different kinds of movements and therapeutic approaches, so we'll look at some of that, and then I'll open it to questions. The main point is really to get an idea of what is unique about orgone therapy in Reich's works. Because if there isn't anything unique about it, then it's just a matter of letting Reich's work sort of get diffused and diffuse as it will in any case. But I think there is something distinctively different about orgone therapy as a clinical practice that's worth at least keeping in focus, whether it stays as independent as I think it should, or develops as it should, remains to be seen. Certainly it becomes more and more limited and more inactive as a general movement, which is unfortunate, but that's sometimes the way things go. Okay. So let me just start out by, I think the real issue is to focus in on what, rather than on what the problems are with reactions to Reich's work was to really emphasize and focus in on a clear statement of what Reich's primary discoveries were, at least as he saw them. Okay? In one sense, Reich felt very strongly that he only made one real discovery that would warrant itself being called a discovery, and that was the discovery of orgone. The rest of his, what I would call discoveries, or he would have considered elaborations and insights into work and things that had been set in motion already by Freud and some other of his colleagues. Clearly, he elaborated them, and there's a scene in Seven Samurai where Shiro Mifune grabs a fly that's going by and scares everybody off. But I didn't scare everybody because it was a moth. Anyway, so clearly, historically, the first major contribution, maybe is a better way to talk about it rather than discovery, was Reich's introduction of the concept of the orgasm reflex. Okay? And this remains central to orgonomy and to Reich's work. Okay? And even there, as Reich pointed out, this was not unique in that the groundwork was set for this by Freud as early as 1910, 1916, possibly earlier. Certainly the concept of the pleasure principle bears, when one reads it carefully, bears striking parallels to and similarities to what Reich elaborates as the orgasm reflex. The difference, and Freud was very acutely aware of this, is that Reich placed this as a central biological function which directed and controlled most of human behavior and human development. Freud began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the insistence on that as a central premise for understanding human behavior. Reich went further in elaborating and doing something which Freud had not really done, which was to observe and study the nature and function of the orgasm process in humans as well as all living matter. That led to his next major, or sort of simultaneous major contribution, which was the understanding of pulsation, particularly the nature of expansion and contraction in living matter and its impact on the somatic functions and physiology of the living organism, and being able to translate that into the nature and function of plasmatic pulsation in humans, right? And then beginning to look at that as a primary cause for dysfunction. Okay? But it's hard for most of us to understand that Freud had made some very startling and very interesting premises about the nature and function of human development, and particularly in the development of libido theory and the concept of the pleasure principle. But basically, no one had really seriously looked at this as how it worked, literally physically in living organisms. Reich is the first to do that. He had the advantage, one, of being young. He had the advantage, secondly, of having, as he always says, and he says in Reich Speaks on Freud, he had the advantage of having Freud lay the groundwork in the direction to look. The other advantage of that, he was the key figure in organizing a mass movement, which was the sex political hygiene movement in Austria and in particularly in Vienna and Berlin, although there were some outlying chapters in various parts of what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What that meant is they were able to establish clinics, in active clinics, sex hygiene clinics, throughout most of the metropolitan areas in Austria and in Germany, and they began to offer broad-based clinical treatment and sex hygiene treatment, gynecological and contraceptive treatment, so that they had a large-scale population to observe. They had babies.
a lot of people don't know this unless you really get into the history of it. Reich is one of the first people to set up clinics where children could be observed, both babies, young mothers, and teenagers could really be actively observed and could actively interact with the observers in terms of asking questions and getting information. The lore, the thing that drew people in, was the idea of having free treatment. These were free clinics. They were polyclinics, and they were primarily sponsored with the approval of Freud initially. But the economics was supported by first the socialists and then the communist movement, social democratic movement in Germany, which Reich never was a member of, but was closely affiliated to and associated with. But based on that work and that active clinical observation, he began to expand also his laboratory investigations and began to look, interestingly, at one-celled organisms. So when you look at this, Reich is looking constantly at small, non-human living matter and large, complex living organisms, and doing a great deal of intensive observation. The goal, of course, was to demonstrate the existence of Freud's libido as a literal energy. This would later lead to what Reich called his major discovery, which is the discovery of the actual energy, which he then decided to rename as orgone energy. We'll get to that in a minute. But so essentially, what is the orgasm reflex as Reich articulates it? I mean, for those of you who've been involved in this kind of work in one way or another for many years, know sort of almost routinely that we're talking about the tension charge formula or the orgasm formula. But there's a tendency to just accept that as sort of, oh yeah, well that's the orgasm reflex, and not really look at it. What Reich was very interested in was the process by which living organisms, and he always liked to talk about looking at amoebas as a primary example, because he would say that to look at an amoeba was a lot easier than looking at a human being, because it's nice, it's contained, and it doesn't have a character structure as such. So you don't really get involved in personalities. Okay? So what was happening is what you could immediately observe in simple one-celled organisms is this immediate, visibly clear plasmatic activity, expansion and contraction movement. Anyone who looks in a microscope and looks at simple one-celled organisms, the first thing that you're going to notice is how much current there is, how much movement there is, how much fluidity, if it's living. It's very interesting because if you look at a simple amoeba when it's stained or dead, if you watch the process of death in an amoeba, it's quite a dramatic process as it turns from this pulsating fluid current producing plasmatic organism to a sudden, like, stone. It goes petrified. It just collapses into permanent contraction and just becomes like a rock. It just goes dead. Okay? It's quite dramatic. So Reich was very interested in the nature of this pulsation and watched it for a long time. And what you see is essentially this process of expansion and contraction. Expansion and contraction. And simultaneously, this expansion and contraction builds towards greater and greater intensity. So what Reich begins to note is that you always have a process in any organism, right, where energetic charge builds, the tension builds, and it essentially grows, it increases. When it reaches maximum or apex or acme, depending on which term you want to use, right, it can go no further without profound alteration. If we had a blackboard, it would be very easy. But in other words, in the simplest, more static terms, if you have a balloon or a bladder, as Reich likes to talk about, and you keep filling it, usually when we talk about this, people start looking at the bathroom. If you keep filling the bladder, drop by drop, what's going to happen? It's going to expand. And if it keeps expanding, at some point, the tension of the membrane is going to reach capacity. If you continue to fill it without discharge, something's going to have to give. Eventually, if it goes long enough, it's going to explode. It's going to disintegrate, literally. Okay? Or you can tap off some of it, in which case you can continue to fill it without any major accidents, but it's not going to become relaxed. Okay? Or you can empty it out, in which case you have a totally relaxed bladder which can begin to fill again. Okay? And that, in simplest terms, that is the orgasm reflex. And that, of course, for human beings, it gets more complicated because we don't like to think of ourselves as just a sack that gets filled up, and has to be discharged. But essentially, it is that pattern of active metabolism that Reich is most interested in. And it is that pattern of active metabolism, right, that Reich, terms and focuses on as the orgasm reflex. So what Reich says is that initially, thinking in Freud's terms, is that libido, this ubiquitous, or this actually in Freud's terms, this contained energy, psychosexual energy that is sort of allotted to each of us at birth, is contained within our organism and periodically builds in tension and then requires discharge. And the most active place that and the fullest degree of discharge would be genitally, in genital contact. Now, clearly, and Freud was clear about this too, all this process can be activated in other activities too. So very early on, even Freud had talked about how important work was as a way of discharging some of this energy, relationships as well as sexual, physical relationships, even just social relationships, as well as general interest in gaining insight into oneself. All of these things maintain a economy or a metabolism of this energy. Yeah.
Why would they be comparable if one seems to be much more physical?
They're not comparable. They're not comparable. They are various aspects. And I think that's often misunderstood. For Reich, socialization is a physical process. Emotional interaction is a physical process. Or maybe more correctly, it is an organismic process. That the problem often that people have with Reich's concepts is that for Reich, he literally, and one of the distinctive features of orgonomy is that the concept of psyche and soma being functionally identical, being essentially functional expressions of the whole organism, is literal for Reich. And I think it's well demonstrated in his experiments and observations. So that the very nature of discussing the difference of social behavior versus physical behavior versus emotional behavior, in a sense, misses Reich's whole point. Reich is very serious when he says, and I'm very insistent on the fact that these are just different expressions of the organism's function. That in fact, the concept that society, that social behavior, sociocultural behaviors, and psycho-emotional behaviors and physical behavior are somehow related but independent is really one of the great tragedies of modern Western thinking. It does not allow us to really approach the problem of the organism as a whole. So in that sense, Reich, of course, is I often will say he's the founder or sort of the granddaddy in Western traditions of holistic approach. But he's very serious about that. It's not about let's talk about the interrelationship between psyche and soma or how. So when contemporary Western medicine now will talk about psyche and soma, implicit in that is the idea that there's a separation. Implicit and explicit in Reich's model, in orgonomic function, is that there is no separation. That these are simply different ways of entering into or examining the function of the organism. And the thing that unifies the function of all social, psychological, and physical behaviors is plasmatic pulsation, is energy. Energy is the binding force. It's like now in astrophysics, everyone's looking for a binding force. And again, the answer is it's some sort of strange energy. I don't know if you saw, the New York Times weekend review a few weeks ago, where essentially, it's been in all the science journals. Astrophysicists are coming closer and closer to discovering that there probably is this sort of ubiquitous natural force in the universe, which Aristotle called quintessence. It was otherwise known as the ether, and of course was largely what Reich was talking about cosmic orgone energy. But what's happening is they can't explain it without finding some unifying force. And Reich is very aware of this, and I think one of the things that's very useful in his insight into this is that there is a binding, unifying force in living organisms, including their social behaviors, which are expressions of their living organisms, and that is energy. And energy metabolizes. It's a fundamental principle.
What does that mean?
It means essentially it builds, it charges and discharges, it pulsates. It comes in and it goes out. It's used up. The simplest thing is, you bring energy in, you use it, and you discharge waste, and then you and your organism essentially processes it, or systems process it and use it. Okay, so metabolism follows very, very clear. Energetic metabolism follows very, very clear rules. Right? A certain amount comes in, a certain amount gets used, and a certain amount goes out. You can actually measure that if you choose to. In Eastern traditions, they don't choose to. They simply understand that as a given. That's Reich was aware of some of the Eastern traditions, and was aware that basically they were talking about this kind of energy. And in the Chinese practitioners that I've spoken to, accept Reich's ideas as pretty sound, but they just don't see. They say it's interesting that somebody spent that much time proving what they already knew, but that's just different systems. Okay, but for Reich, the important thing was this whole premise that essentially you were dealing with a literal energy, not a speculative energy. For Freud, the energy is highly speculative. And he doesn't really do any solid research. Matter of fact, he says, one of my students will study this eventually and demonstrate what it is. And the assumption, of course, was that what they would study and find essentially was that libido was essentially a bioelectrical and biochemical energy in the system. Reich started out on that premise. Okay. In the process, he demonstrated to his own surprise that this didn't hold up as a bioelectric energy. It didn't. I'm not going to go into the great details of this, but essentially, the process did not adequately explain the amount of energy being dealt with. So there were quantities of energy that couldn't be explained by simple, bioelectrical, biochemical processes, the result of which was that there were clearly other energy sources that were not explained. So based on the lack of that explanation, he proceeded to look further and examine further. And one thing led to another, and eventually, of course, he comes up with and isolates, quite by accident, a literal energy that's visible, demonstratable, and measurable. And that he gives the name orgone energy. I've given lectures on this before. I'm not going to go into a detailed description of the science and the discovery of orgone energy. It's available for those of you who don't know it already or are interested in Reich's bioelectrical experiments into the origins of life. You can see the actual steps taken to that discovery. Okay? But the other major contribution coming out of this is if you have this kind of central pulsation in the living organism, and the need for this constant process of charge, tension, peak, discharge, relaxation, which is dynamic. Those of you who've seen my diagram board, it keeps going. It doesn't just go round and round like this. It keeps moving ahead progressively. In other words, the tension and charge is a dynamic force. It doesn't just happen continuously in the same place, in the same
No,
location.
that's not clear. I don't understand what you're
So
saying.
it's easier if I had a blackboard, but in principle, what's happening is you don't just go through tension and charge and sit in one place. The tension and charge process continues in every area of engagement in your living process. So that's to answer why it happens and can be translated and talked about in social processes. I mean, if you're with a mate and aroused and embracing, and there's a lot of energy, and there's a deep orgasm and a deep release, that's very clear, right? Although it might not be the same the next time, or in the next place, or the next circumstance, or the next person, or the next mating. But that same principle operates when you get up and go to the bathroom, or when you get up or interact with your child, or when you get up when you're nursing, if you're a nursing mother, or when you go to work and you get on your lab coat and start doing your work, or you get in front of your kids and you start teaching, wherever it is, that same pulsatory function is operating, and in one way or another, energy is being charged and discharged in those interactions. Now, albeit they might not be quite of the same intensity, or sometimes it can be. We all know, we all have experiences of doing work at times that leaves us totally, unfortunately most of us don't have that experience too often, but when you do have that experience of doing something that really totally engages you and where you have a full and intense discharge, you can feel as relaxed and as fully gratified as having had a very deep sexual encounter. And vice versa. There are sexual encounters that can leave you feeling very, very ungratified and unsatisfied. So again, these are processes that are systemic and pervade all of living. And of course, Reich later goes on to say pervades all of nature and pervades all of cosmic operations that these are. And at some very fundamental level, it seems reasonable. Why should we, as organisms, it always seemed to me when I first started studying as an anthropologist, years and years ago, it always seemed strange to me when we were told that while we were animals, we were uniquely different than other animals. And it never quite made sense to me that we should be that uniquely different. That seemed, it just didn't seem, not because of any particular respect for other animals versus human beings. It just didn't seem to make sense that if everything was true for every other creature in the world and every other system in the world, somehow it didn't apply to us unless we were chosen. And I think that's what's the hidden message, the mysticism behind all that, is that we are only uniquely different if something has made us exceptionally uniquely different, and what the history of that is another lecture. But in fact, what Reich is very, very interested in is then what is necessary to maintain and or reestablish really both issues. Later, the issue of maintaining this kind of plasmatic current, this plasmatic pulsation, this effective pulsation in the organism becomes central to Reich. The idea of prophylaxis, working with children, preventing problems before they arise. But certainly from a clinical perspective, the issue is how do you, if you have an individual or an organism or a plant, it really doesn't matter on some level, that is profoundly restricted in terms of its natural functions for whatever reason, and it really doesn't matter. It could be because of problematic life experiences and parenting, which in one sense is not that much different, as Reich points out, to as a tree that is planted in bad soil. It's just the circumstances of the environment. Okay? Human beings don't feel comfortable saying, how could you compare me to being a bad plant or an organism that was raised with not enough sunlight? But it's not different. It's just the nature of the organism. So if we are damaged in some way or not able to metabolize adequately or effectively, it's going to have, with any other organism. We have no trouble understanding that with plants, right? We know that if a plant doesn't get everything it needs, right, it's going to be damaged in some way. With human beings, we're much less willing to accept the fact that failure to thrive is a primary result of bad environmental circumstances for growth. Okay? So if that's the case, what Reich was trying to face clinically was how do you reestablish as much as possible that kind of effective metabolism, or the ability for the organism to get back to or as close to that kind of ideal metabolic process of pulsation, of a free plasmatic streaming throughout the organism. Okay? And from about 1926 on, Reich really actively begins to move towards the investigation and creation of clinical practices that will lead to the freeing of that kind of energetic function in the organism. He begins to really see that the primary goal and redefine the primary goal of treatment as reestablishing the greatest capacity for plasmatic streaming in the organism and orgasm function in the human organism. Okay? And it's at that point that he begins to run into trouble with the psychoanalytic movement because essentially the psychoanalytic movement, the mainstream of the psychoanalytic movement at that time was moving very, very drastically away from that kind of central role for libido to begin with, and they're certainly not about to adopt a very, very deep biological model. Freud himself has been on record by that time as saying that all efforts must be made to convince the younger members of the psychoanalytic community, and it's very clear in his notes that he means primarily Reich, because Reich was the one who was pushing the strongest for this, that all efforts must be made to dissuade and even crush members of the younger members of the movement who are insisting on a biological base for psychoanalysis. Right? The reason, interestingly, had nothing to do with the fact that he thought it was wrong. In fact, in Freud's private journals, he's pretty clear that it's probably right and it's probably accurate. The reason being that Freud was deathly afraid that if biology became a dominant center in psychoanalysis, right, this kind of concept of energy and biological function, that psychoanalysis would be subsumed into naturalist studies in biology and become a footnote. It would no longer be a dominant.
It's interesting that he was right.
Probably
because
is.
now we have pills. We have the antidepressants, which is now the main treatment for...
To a large extent, that's
Right.
right. So, circumstantially, historically, Reich wound up being, in one sense or another, on the losing side, at least for that moment, historically, not necessarily in the long run. These things often have to be looked at over possibly hundreds and hundreds of years, so the record is still out. Clearly, much of what Reich had to say keeps coming back to haunt both the psychoanalytic community and the biological community and the natural science community over and over again, whether it's in Reich's words or in just their own need to find new explanations for things that they can't explain. But clearly he was onto something. And the idea of developing a clinical treatment that allowed for increasing effective reestablishment of the ability to have a full orgasm at the right moment and to engage orgastically in life. And that's an often forgotten point of Reich. Reich talks about the concept also, introduced the concept of orgastic potency. And usually that is mistakenly understood to mean being able to get an erection and to have sex, and for a woman to get lubricated and have sex and feel, oh boy, I can go all night. And that's not at all what Reich is talking about. Orgastic potency means the ability to engage actively, energetically in life, including all of life's functions, which include obviously and primarily sexual engagement, which is a primary human function, but it means being able to eat effectively, enjoyably, to enjoy work. And don't forget, the model that Reich pulls from Freud also and modifies and increases is love, work, and knowledge are the well springs of life and should govern life. And that's really what he means, is that orgasmic potency is not just about getting it on, or getting intense sexual sensation and having sex, or as Jack Nicholson says, Jack Nicholson, having been in organ therapy, likes to go on national TV. Yeah, people didn't know that? Yeah, he was a patient of Dr. Duval's and some other people, but Nicholson likes to say in public, so you'll excuse the vulgarity, since Nicholson said that you go into organ therapy and you really learn to fuck good.
Is that what he said?
Oh, yeah.
And he was serious?
Yeah, no, it's very serious. But this is not an uncommon, and if those of you who knew Dr. Sobey and spoke to Dr. Sobey, would say that many patients would come to orgonomy, especially when he was very active, even when Reich was around. Reich would go ballistic on this with the idea, especially men would come with the idea, I'm going to meet an orgone, woman from the orgone group, or the Reich group, and they fuck like bunnies. That was the whole, and Reich would just become irate. And there are many stories. For instance, Reich experimented later on with group therapy using orgone. A lot of people don't know that, but back in the 40s, he had already started looking into the possibilities of group work. Right? He was interested in it, and then after about 6 months or a year, I don't know the exact timing on this, he announced to all the doctors that was the end of that. There would be no more of that. And the reason was that all the doctors were coming back saying, gee, my women patients, we've been getting a huge influx, but predominantly males coming into these groups, signing up for these groups, And my women patients have been coming in complaining that after sessions, men are coming up and saying, let's go back to your place. And he said, I'm not running a dating service and a sex, operation here. And he said that, this is not about health. And so he closed the book on that, at least, in terms of their work. But I think the point there is there's been profound misunderstanding of what Reich means by function of the orgasm and by orgastic potency. Orgastic potency means the ability to direct your energy appropriately to an intense engagement with whatever presents itself. And when it presents itself appropriately, so that that the energy can be metabolized actively on an ongoing process, on a continuum. Okay? So essentially, by really 1933, Reich was pretty strongly separate. And historically, there were a lot of things that went on around, I say 1933 because that's the beginning of the end of Reich's association with the psychoanalytic movement. Officially, it's not until about 1934 that it really ends formally. But by that time, Reich's whole model for practice, which was known at that point as character analysis, which was still actively a dominant model in psychoanalysis and still is to a large extent, was clearly moving very, very aggressively in a physical direction. Reich had already by that time become much, much more interested in the way people physically hold against normal plasmatic sensation in the organism. If you read character analysis seriously, it's very clear by 1926, in the earliest first editions of character analysis, that he's begun to be less interested in the way people psychically alter their experience of reality, or their experience in the world, and much more interested in the physical roots of this. But by 1933, he was clearly beginning to articulate a technical practice, a therapy that was in many, many ways beginning to have distinctive differences from mainstream free associative psychoanalytic therapy. His therapy in general by that time had become a much, much more active therapy. He had moved from behind the couch to the center of the couch. He had begun to have his patients disrobe even then, and at least selectively. He had begun to work directly on the physical base. Now, some people think of that as possibly very radical and dramatic, except if you understand it historically, it wasn't quite as radical and dramatic as it appears, since Freud had experimented with physical intervention with his patients, and had actually, much earlier than that, Freud had experimented with physical manipulation of the body and use of hands on the body and pressing on various aspects of the body to elicit physical and emotional responses, and then backed off of it because he was disturbed and distressed by some of the results that he got that he couldn't control. It was too active. So he retreated, which was probably characteristic of Freud. The same had happened with hypnosis. Freud had been one of the key innovators in the use of hypnosis as early as 1890s, okay? But backed off when he began to realize that he couldn't control everything that came up when people were placed into deep trance, and was not. Dr. Sobio used to say, yeah, what happened was he started getting down into the deeper layers and was not comfortable with and couldn't control what was coming out, and it scared him. In Freud's own journals, he writes about instances where patients began to go into trance and began to come up with stuff that was very, very startling, very, very frightening, particularly about sexual abuse and early adolescent experience, and then he couldn't bring them out of the trance for a while, and there were all sorts of problems. Freud has a history, if you read Freud, of getting involved in a lot of experimental directions, some of which were quite, in retrospect, seem ludicrous, like nasal surgery, and William Fleece and others. But
what?
Nasal surgery. There was a period of belief with his closest friend and associate in the early days of psychoanalysis, Wilhelm Fleece, was a doctor in Berlin, who was foremost numerologist as well as neurosurgeon.
Numerologist.
He was interested in the effect of numbers on life. And Freud never comfortably agreed with that, but he sort of went along, saying, yeah, it's interesting. But more significantly, Fleece was convinced that all pathology, psycho-emotional pathology, was a problem in the nose, the nasal structure, and that by operating and working directly on the nose, you could correct all sorts of problems, particularly the hysterias. And they went pretty far with some of this stuff. Now, it's very interesting. If anyone knows the physiology of the nose, the tissue of the nose and the tissues of the genitals, male and female genitals, are identical. They're erectile, erogenous tissue. The exact same tissue. So the idea, by the way, of people getting, the idea of flaring nostrils as a sign of passion is directly related to sexual tension. In other words, you can get an erect nose.
And the corollary is as old as Shakespeare. A person who sneezes is afraid
Right.
Is what?
of encounter. A person who sneezes is afraid of an encounter.
Right, yeah. I mean, there are all sorts of, there's a huge body of folklore about what the nose and expressions and things that come from the nose. And so this is not completely, and even things like phrenology and such have some, what Reich would say, and I think that's not a bad, another point, one of the great contributions of Reich as far in terms of common sense. Reich says anything that's out there that people create has some reality and has some connection with something that is genuine. That nothing is created out of just, with no basis in truth. The key for any serious student of human behavior is to try to figure out what the real source is. You don't necessarily assume that it just means that you cut the nose or you operate on the nose and all the problems go away. I mean, that's a little bit simplistic, but that there might be some connection. I think what all of these people were, in Freud himself, were moving towards was an understanding that there was a deep physical connection to emotional and social behavior. And it starts there. And I think Reich it picks up on that. So by 1933, he's clearly moving at a much, much more comprehensive approach to the whole organism. And he's articulating that. And it's disturbing a lot of the more conservative, established center around Freud and with Freud himself. By 1934, Reich has been pushed out of the movement, or actually resigns himself. By 1937, 36-37, in Scandinavia, Reich now moves away from what he calls classic character analysis and moves into a much more clearly physiologically based approach towards treatment that they call at that time, for a brief period of time, vegetotherapy, meaning working on the vegetative nervous system or the physiological system of the organism. And there he begins to articulate the classic general clinical practice of treating body and mind as a functional whole and beginning to work on techniques for doing this. And there the treatment moves more and more directly towards active work on the way the organism physically armors itself. In other words, the way the body begins to hold against these plasmatic sensations, these pulsations within itself, which Reich begins to increasingly see as the origin, not necessarily the specific history in any given patient, but always at base. In other words, each patient can come in and say, well, my mother did this to me, and then this happened to me when I was 5 years old, and this happened when I was 7. That's your individual narrative. But at base, in every organism, for Reich and for the model he was articulating, is that you have to look beyond that individual set of conditions to the idea that what all patients have in common is that someplace along the line that plasmatic pulsation was interfered with. And when it begins to be interfered with radically, you're going to get pathology, you're going to get some sort of dysfunction. And as Reich says, you block a stream that's running, eventually the pressure is going to build and the water is going to be diverted or moved in a particular direction. And that direction will be purely the result of what? Purely the result of what the water encounters. In other words, it'll look for the place that it can most easily find, release or access to. So that the same will happen in the human organism. If there's enough damage, as Reich says, to the ability of the organism to freely pulsate, different individuals will develop different characteristic ways of coping with that. And they will find ways of holding in their body, and those forms of holding against the plasmatic sensations, against these natural pulsations, will find ways of reflecting themselves in characteristic behaviors. One individual might decide that the best strategy is just to resign themselves, become passive, become a very nice, cooperative individual. Another individual might become rebellious. Another individual might become promiscuously sexual, using sexual flirtation as a way of controlling the world. Another individual might become aggressively violent or threatening. I mean, and on and on and on, in the sense that the listing of the characteristic ways that any individual could present behaviorally isn't really as significant as what the unifying common functioning principle is, which is that every one of those individuals, thousands upon thousands of them, millions of them that have been damaged, right, all share a alteration in their ability to experience effective metabolism and plasmatic sensation movement in their organism. Okay? So by 1940s, though, the most significant breakthrough here, up until this time, up until the 30s or early 40s, Reich was assuming to a large extent that the energy he was talking about was libido. It was Freud's libido, which we saw as a bioelectric energy. But simultaneously to this work, he's doing laboratory work that leads circumstantially to the discovery of this biological ubiquitous energy that he comes to call and name orgone energy. And the nature of that energy, he establishes, is ubiquitous, meaning it's in the atmosphere. That in fact, he demonstrates that Freud, which always seemed to me, even in my reading before I discovered the works of Reich, I never could understand Freud's premise that you're born and except in religious terms, that sort of you're born and this spirit of life is sort of infused in you. You get a certain quantity of psychosexual energy that will run out over your lifetime, and when it's out, you're dead. That's basically what it comes down to. It didn't seem to me to be, justifiable on the basis of any observed phenomenon in nature. So, it was sort of a nice metaphor, but it still is, but it didn't seem. And that what Reich comes to observe is that in fact it's not a finite quantity of energy. That in fact it is a constantly available, natural, free-floating energy, ubiquitous energy that living organisms, not just humans, that all living organisms are able to metabolize, to take in, use, and discharge, and process, and maintain function. And that in one way, the definition of living matter versus non-living matter is that ability to metabolize the energy. Because the energy is ubiquitous even in non-living matter. That's an important principle that Reich discovers. The same energy is there in rocks. The difference is, in rocks, it doesn't metabolize. It might move through the rock. It might be transmitted through the rock. It doesn't metabolize. The rock doesn't use the energy. Living matter, and why and how that happened is an interesting area to speculate on. At what point non-living matter, began to transform into matter that could begin to use or maintain a pulsatory reaction with this. It's hard to say. This is a big area of research today, even in the mainstream sciences, where you go from non-living to living. Reich is interesting there because he's the first person to demonstrate where it happens, how it happens, but why it happens, no one has, even Reich can only speculate. Towards the end, of course, which makes people convinced that Reich was crazy, he speculates that it happens probably because of aliens, space impact, but who knows? Where those aliens came from, how they got going, we don't know either. But certainly the idea that there is this force, I think, becomes increasingly central to Reich's work. And once he has the discovery, the genuine discovery and demonstration of orgone energy, he proposes his final clinical model, which is orgone therapy, which incorporates character analysis and incorporates vegetotherapy, but now becomes focused on the primary thing which is unique in and is the primary difference between orgone therapy, as I understand it, and any other kind of treatment, which is the goal in orgone therapy is to reestablish the effective plasmatic streaming of energy. This is pretty much a direct quote from Reich, in the organism, the ability of the organism to tolerate that and to effectively discharge in all aspects of their life, and particularly to fully discharge in a sexual embrace. In the ability to surrender as freely as possible, as fully as possible, to a full orgasm in the terms that we've just described. For a full allowing of the organism to reach full charge and then to freely, without restriction, discharge. Now, the big error, and I always have to put a warning on here because it's too easily mystified. I think one of the great failures in orgone therapy has been to make it clear to all patients, all people involved, that this is an ideal model. all too often people who've been in orgone therapy or come to therapies around us have a tendency to say, well, if I don't become fully orgastic and if I don't become the full genital individual, I am a failure, I am lost, life is meaningless, there's no, and Reich never conceived of it as such, and no serious orgone therapist that I've ever worked with or studied with, Dr. Sobey, Dr. Rothenberg, a number of others, has ever proposed that unless you become a fully ideally genital organism, therapy is not useful or successful, that you have to look at it in terms of degrees of success and also the circumstances of the world we live in. Dr. Sobey was always very fond, those of you who knew him, of saying, well, even if I could get you to be fully genital, if you got to be fully genital, you wouldn't make it out to the corner. He said, I would be irresponsible to put you out on the street that way. And there probably was some basic truth, there was basic truth to that. But the reality is also, as Reich pointed out, that once we're doing treatment, this is where the next big shift took place. Towards the end of his career, similar to the history of people like Freud, there was a certain sadness that came over him when he realized how big the task was. And at that point, he realized that once we're doing treatment with adults, we're dealing with a best scenario situation. We're looking for what we can do to maximally correct serious dysfunctions, usually. So if an individual comes in, the issue in therapy is not, can you correct 20 or 30 years of damage, completely, sort of erase it. The issue is, can you bring that person closer to that ideal, or as close as that individual is capable of going, and therefore affecting more and more productive ability to be in the world. Right? That the goal remains the same always, which is the establishment of the orgasm function. That is unique to orgone therapy. No other therapy seeks that as its goal. Right? But the idea that failure to do anything less than that is a complete failure in treatment is also an error in thinking.
As I recall, Mike also, in conjunction with that, said that the concept of absolutism was a neurotic concept to begin with.
Absolutely.
So that genitality is not an absolute.
That's right. It's
you may be genital now, and 10 minutes later you may not.
Very good. That absolutism is a mystical concept. Don't forget, the ultimate absolutism is what? God.
Right.
God is the ultimate absolute. Just as and in physics, the ultimate mystical aspect of physics is the concept of absolutes. And so Niels Bohr and others come along and say, well, there really are no absolutes. There are probabilities. That messes them all up. Okay? Einstein, and this is what the other part of it is what's going on in physics today, is that as they get more and more in touch with how complex the problem is and how difficult it is to find a simple solution, rather than look for the idea of unifying forces within the system, many physicists are turning to God. Because that's easy, it's much more mystical. They're saying, well, there must be forces beyond us that are dictating or controlling this. Einstein himself, if those of you who read Einstein's work at all, towards the end, the last 20 years, which is why mainstream physics doesn't pay as much attention to Einstein's later work, is he began to feel that there must be a guiding hand in all this. So he himself began to become, somewhat, and always had an element of possible mysticism, except when he was doing pure mathematics, which I'd say he was at his best. So in that context, then, to the extent that I would say is possible, that is pretty much what orgone, beyond talking about what techniques you do, which is not my interest or interest in doing this kind of presentation, but to understand that when we talk about orgone therapy as opposed to the Reichian therapies or whatever, we'll get to those in a minute, orgone therapy in simplest terms is an attempt to reestablish the effective regulation, or in a sense self-regulation to whatever extent the organism is possible, for the plasmatic movement and pulsation of energy and metabolism of energy within the living organism, the human organism in this case. Okay? I mean, I guess one could conceive it to be and there are people who work with plants who use organomic concepts, and that's fine. But since we're talking about clinical model with human beings, the object here is with human organisms to maintain that. Certainly, a strong push in Reich in the later years was to develop this and to relate this to prophylaxis, to move away from clinical treatment and to begin to engage in more and more active attempts at increasing the possibilities of parents and workers, school teachers, etc., to work with children in preventing a situation where you have to intervene to reestablish, so that ideally, so that what is there remains relatively intact to begin with and doesn't have to be, approached clinically later on. How far that got, we all, some of you go back long enough to know that it didn't get that far in terms of an active movement, although it's probably had, and that's another topic too, it's probably had profound impact on a significant number of educational and child development and child concepts, child working with children, which I think are very positive. So I think I think it's not without significance that Dr. Rothenberg, who was is an organomist and was a close associate of Reich and a number of others, wound up becoming the co-editor of Spock's Baby and Child Care, and that while he doesn't declare himself to be working organomically in Spock's Baby and Child Care, clearly if you read the editions that Rothenberg wrote, basically, since Spock was pretty inactive for the last 3 or 4 editions, they're clearly influenced by a lot of this kind of understanding and insight. So these things have their way of penetrating the social environment, which leads us then to what are the Reichian therapies. And essentially, the first thing to keep in mind is that because Reich was such a protean and central figure, although in the history of psychoanalysis, like the way the communists tended to write history, which is people were written out. In the history of psychoanalysis, Reich is central to the second generation of, actually technically the third generation, but the second major generation of psychoanalysts. And Reich is a central figure there. And really, much of Reich's work is pivotal in the direction that modern psychoanalysis begins to move in. Much of Anna Freud's work is really drawn very strongly from Reich's work in the late 20s and early 30s, and she was a member of his seminar. It was called Kindergarten Seminar. The younger, Freud used to tease them, the young. Now, largely, her concepts of ego and the work with the ego comes strongly from what was being developed in that character analytic seminar. And certainly much of what develops in the direction of object relations has very, very strong roots in Reich's work of the last period of his career in psychoanalysis. More significantly, much of, and I was looking for a connection and finally found it in my research into John Bowlby's work. I'm working on John Bowlby is the child psychiatrist, psychoanalytic child psychiatrist, major figure and very important in the history of child development studies. And I was convinced that Bowlby must have known Reich's work, though there's no direct references to it, and then discovered that turning point in Bowlby's career was a summer he spent before he decided to become a child psychiatrist, to go into medicine and become a child psychiatrist. He spent the summer working with A.S. Neal at Summerhill. And he said it was the most important summer of his life. He understood the importance of children. So there's no way that you spend a summer in 1940, in 1930s rather, late 1930s working with Neal and you don't know. And if anyone knows Neal's relationship to Reich, Summerhill basically became a experimental laboratory for a lot of Reich's ideas on child rearing. Neil was a direct conduit for that, including doing child therapy using a lot of Reich's ideas. So essentially, that's one influence that we find of Reich into modern psychoanalysis, but that's not Reichian. I mean, in the sense that it's Reichian in that, it's Reich's influence there. And in some ways, I feel more comfortable with some of that use of Reich, because with these kinds of early uses of Reich, they're very clearly using particular theoretical material, theoretical insights, theoretical and even clinical premises in the development of their own clinical model. And to the degree that they're responsible, they cite Reich and they see Reich as a direct influence there, a direct point of departure. However, when we talk about Reichian therapies, we're really addressing a group of specific therapies that identify themselves as Reichian. And here, just as again an enjoinder, Reich warned that even before his death, you would begin to see various people and individuals taking a piece of his work and establishing their own therapeutic model. And he said there was nothing wrong with that in principle, provided they were clear about what they were doing and clear about their dissociation from orgonomy. However, that did not tend to be the case. The three really primary Reichian therapies that I would identify, and once I throw this out, you can add other things and raise other questions, would be the most visible one is the work of Alexander Lowen, the clinical model of Alexander Lowen, known as bioenergetics. Historically, just to set the record straight, Lowen was a patient, was a gym teacher in New York. He was a patient of Dr. Reich's, attended some of his lectures at the New School in the early 1940s. Soon after the war was over, Reich, Lowen talked about was actually beginning to do therapy on his own without Reich's permission. Reich said, if you want to do this, you have to become trained, you have to become clinically credentialed. Lowen went to Europe, became a doctor. Came back, never came into training with Reich, started doing treatment. And Reich, Dr. Sobey was ordered by Dr. Reich to have Lowen come in to talk and told that he had to go into training. Lowen said, I don't have to go into training, I've gone beyond Dr. Reich. And Dr. Reich said, fine, and don't associate yourself with my movement or say you were trained by me. And for a long time, Lowen didn't, until Reich died. Since then, Lowen has maintained that he was trained by Reich, and that's an outright lie. He was never trained by Reich, other than, in a sense, if you've been in treatment, you've gotten something, but he was never a clinically trained orgonomist. Lowen, significantly and interestingly, I would say probably central to all of the Reichian therapies, and the thing that makes them distinctly different than orgonomy, is the first thing that they all do is they desexualize. They remove the orgasm formula from the center of the work. So that classically, in Lowen's case, sexuality is important, it's a normal behavior, but more significantly, we're dealing with this energy. And we have to get the energy moving so that one can be more friendly, more engaged, more loving, more physically active and robust. Lowen is always, in my interactions with him, my witnessing of his presentations, he's always really struck me as a gym teacher. Very enthusiastic, very lively. I don't know if some of you knew him. Very enthusiastic, very lively, very, let's get out there, let's do these exercises. And very much, as I described once to Dr. Sobey, I saw Lowen on a talk show, afternoon talk show. And he went out in his group, big group, and got people to come up, and he had all these devices, just different people from the audience. And he said, okay, lie down here and breathe. And he said, now stand up, how do you feel? And the woman said, I feel great. He said, you see? 3 minutes and I can get them feeling great. So it's a very energetic and lively approach, but essentially, if you read the journals of bioenergetic journals, there is no understanding, there is no base, what the energy is, what it does, how it operates, how it metabolizes in the system is never addressed. What exactly the goals are, other than feeling better and being happier and working, which is fine, are not focused. There is no central goal in terms of, as an organoid, of establishing this kind of pulsatory, and there is no concept of pulsation, there's concept of energy. What it does, it's very, very vague. But what is different about it, very distinctly different from orgone treatment, for instance, as a model, is that it is very, very detailed in the steps. In other words, you can list how you do it. Step 1, the therapist should do this. Step 2, the therapist should do. There are a lot of how-to. So much so that you can be certified and trained in bioenergetics initially within over an intensive 3-day weekend. So you get an idea in terms of how and what. It's a practical how-to kind of treatment. Now, that is not to say, and I'm not denigrating, I've encountered a number of bioenergetically trained therapists who are quite serious and know a great deal and can do a great deal. But essentially, the distinction here is that it is not centered on the issues that Reich was focused on. What it does is take the insight that by directly interacting with the physical structure of the organism, you can essentially create greater energetic liveliness in the organism, and that again, there are a series of specific interventions and exercises that can be done. It has a very sort of practical how-to and self-help kind of quality to it.
If I could add a characteristic, I find you very tolerant of this, whereas I understand that he's very dangerous.
Yeah, no,
I'm very harm to some patients.
I'm less tolerant of Alexander Lowen, who I think is, and I'll openly say, I think is a liar and a fraud on some very profound issues. I don't say that just personally. I just say that based on the fact that I've documented specific lies, including the one that he was trained by an associate of Reich. But my tolerance of it is I think there are a number of individuals who are within that area of training who work quite responsibly and are quite serious and are willing to deal with their own limitations and with their own nature of their model. So I'm not prepared to say that it can be of no help to anybody. But certainly, as with anything, but as Reich would say, and I can tell you, there are many ergonomists who are not responsible either and have done damage and who do not follow the primary directive of first do no harm. Okay, so this is the nature of the problem that Reich elicited, which is the nature of structure. I mean, if your structure is such that you're likely to be too aggressive or too out of touch or too self-important, you can often lose sight of the patient and do harm, even though you're representing what is effectively maybe a very positive form of treatment. The next major Reichian therapy that actively identifies itself as centrally involved with Reich's work is the work of John Parakis. And that is it's had a number of different incarnations in terms of its names, but I guess that's, if anyone knows Parakis, that's sort of an intended as a pun. Parakis also believes in reincarnation, and channeling, but it's had, the movement has had a number of incarnations in terms of its name. The most consistent one is a thing called core energetics. Parakis was a colleague of, to set the history straight here, a colleague of, friend and colleague of Lowen's, and was actively involved in the establishment of bioenergetics initially, but broke away with him because for Parakis, it wasn't spiritual enough. So Parakis, interestingly, brings in the other, and in a sense is one of the forerunners of one of the first New Age, Reichian New Age movements. Parakis brings in and then marries a woman who's a channeler and a mystic and they bring in the spiritual, mystical, and to point and focus to this energy. And in one sense, they have a much more clear sense of what the direction is, which is essentially a spiritual, mystical, function of the energy and direction of the energy. Paracas, interesting. All these guys have a consistent pattern. They all misrepresent their relationship to Reich. Paracas maintains himself publicly in all of his writings as having been trained and been associated with Reich, and he wasn't. He met Reich literally once in the presence of Dr. Sobey for a consultation about possibly being trained by Dr. Reich. And the famous story there was that they met and he was a resident. And Reich said, yes, we'll consider you for training, but first you must go into treatment. Reich said, okay. And Reich told him his fee, which at that time was $50, which was in 1950s or so, a pretty hefty fee. And Paracas said to Reich, well, Dr. Reich, I assumed you would give me a special rate. And Reich said that was to give you a good sense of how Reich operated. He said to Paracas, Dr. Paracas, if you were special, I would give you a special rate. Paracas never came back. That is, to my knowledge, unless there's other evidence, only time, and I've asked Paracas how many times he met Reich, and he said, well, a couple, it was very vague. That Paracas had any contact with Reich. He clearly was not trained, he attended seminars, open lectures, but again, Paracas establishes this movement which is still active and training. The other primary strongly influenced movement, actually, which in some way almost predates in certain elements the work of Lowen and Paracas, is Yanov's work, Arthur Yanov, Primal Scream. It tends not to be as big now as it was in the 60s or 70s, although it keeps resurfacing. Primal Scream, of course, draws very, very strongly on some of the more aggressive aspects of body and physiological work on the organism, but essentially works on the idea that on the simplification of the idea that if you can get the individual to really release their overall pent-up emotional rage in one great moment, that they will break through and all things will come into place. That's the original presentation of it. Earlier critics, Orgonomus and others, said this is really dangerous because you're going to break people open, and we know very much. I could have every one of you down and break you open. There are techniques that can do that. That's not very surprising. But to do this in an uncontrolled situation, basically the old technique of, does anyone know the old technique of Primal Scream, how it was done? Paid huge amounts of money for it too, usually $1,500 for a weekend. And you would go to a motel where you would register and stay isolated in the motel alone with no contact with anybody else. You would see the therapist for active, ongoing, long-term intervention all day, sometimes even into the evening, until basically they broke you down. And then you would return to your motel to spend the time alone. And some individuals said this was incredible. They came out feeling completely restructured. Others wound up in institutions because of physical breakdown, physical and emotional breakdowns. Very shortly after that, there's a history in the Primal Scream work of revised editions of the Primal Scream, the book by Yanov, in which he keeps increasingly the number of warnings and beginning to change the approach and modify it and sort of make it more user-friendly and a little less aggressive because they were getting sued and there were like major tragedies taking place. And then by the 70s, with the rise of the New Age, Primal Scream became less central, and many of the people trained in the Primal Scream began to just sort of move off and do their own work and use some of the ideas rather than be strictly involved in the movement. So those are really, in my estimation, the only primarily strongly identified and clearly Reichian therapies that identify themselves. Along with that, however, there are a number of other important movements that clearly saw their starting points or take off from Reich's work. The most significant of those would be Fritz Perls and Hefferlin's work and Paul Goodman in the development of Gestalt therapy. Fritz Perls had been a patient of Reich's in Vienna and Berlin, and had been part of the seminar with Reich, and had come to Reich when he came to this country and asked him, along with Paul Goodman, to help them start the Gestalt movement, at which point Reich said, I have my own group, I wish you luck, but it's not for me. And I think Gestalt has its roots in a much more sound psychoanalytic, really comes out of the work of Reich largely from the 1920s and 30s, in which character analysis and the idea of character type and a stronger psychoanalytic base, and probably and uses a lot more group techniques and psychodrama techniques, and probably remains as of many of the models a much more responsible clinical model. The most interesting figure in that group was actually Hefferlin, who was a physical psychologist, physiologist, who wrote a number of very interesting studies in which he did a lot, and it's never spent as much attention as given to it as should be. He did a lot of laboratory work demonstrating much of the rediscovering, in effect, and redemonstrating much of Reich's early work in physiology and biology and plasmatic sensation, and that work in the physiological base of behavior by Hefferlin is very, very strong, very, very valuable, and very good sort of. I've always wondered why. I knew Reich never saw it because most of it came out later. I've always wondered why the more established groups in ergonomy, like the American College and stuff, have not gone to Hefferlin's work, probably because he's not part of the group. But Hefferlin's work actually is another very strong, independent demonstration of the existence of what Reich was working with and talking about. So I think there's a lot of value there. The other movements that are interesting in relation to Reich and Reich's ideas, but again, every one of these that I've mentioned so far, and the ones I'll continue to mention with one interesting exception, do not see sexual function and the orgasm function as in any way central to the goals of treatment. The next one would be probably the Alexander technique or the Feldenkrais technique. Feldenkrais, these are basically physical. Alexander, certainly on his own, was not interested in a therapeutic, psychotherapeutic model. He was interested in simply getting people to walk better, run better, work better, be more physically integrated. And the original concepts of the Alexander technique are quite effective in ways of loosening, opening, grounding the body, getting people moving. There's nothing inconsistent with any of the work. I would encourage many of my patients to do the groups, it's movement. And with the Alexander technique, in terms of the impact, and he doesn't talk, there's some interesting places where he clearly knew about Reich and was interested in Reich, but nothing serious. What's happened with the Alexander technique is there are many people who are trained as Alexander teachers who have decided to become therapists and integrate bits and pieces of Reich's ideas with Alexander technique. Those are what we would call the Reichians, who are using Alexander training as a basis for doing their practice. And I can't talk much about them because each one has a sort of different model for doing it. Feldenkrais is very, very interesting. Richard Feldenkrais knew Reich's work, was very interested in, and clearly in Feldenkrais's writings, again, it's another body alignment, body movement treatment. It's more of a treatment than just a practice or a self-help thing. Feldenkrais clearly saw one of the goals as not only getting the body to work and to pulsate effectively and to move effectively, but that this would lead to a healthy sexual balance in one's life and an ability to reach out and have an active sexual engagement with the world. He doesn't quite get to Reich's model, but clearly has a sense that this is a vital part of life and living in a healthy organism, and very interesting. Again, many of the practitioners who come out of the Feldenkrais movement have a tendency to incorporate a little more of the aggressive ideas of body work, although Feldenkrais himself was a lot more moderate in his approach. Feldenkrais and Alexander are two very strong presence, particularly Feldenkrais, in the New Age movement, particularly the 70s and 80s into the present. The other last interesting sideline here is a psychiatrist who's gotten some attention named Davinloo. Last name John Davinloo.
Davinloo?
Yeah, Davinloo, Davanloo. And he developed back into the 70s a aggressive short-term resistance therapy, which is largely incorporating much of the early character analytic resistance therapy of Reich from the early character analytic phase of Reich's work. It has no intent, it remains strongly based in psychoanalytic, character analytic frame. It has no goals of establishing anything other than treatment of specific psychiatric disorders with aggressive interventions, and it's very, very technique laden. It doesn't have much in terms of long-range goal other than someone presents with a obsessive compulsive disorder, we're going to treat the obsessive compulsive disorder in the following way. And they're very, very specific techniques. They use tapes very actively, work with the patient. It's very short-term, usually anywhere from 12 to 20 sessions, and uses a lot of the techniques that Reich articulated in the early character analytic phase. It can be very effective. It can be very dramatically effective. It's also very limited. Interestingly, Davinloo, when questioned by me and others at meetings, gets very uncomfortable when people bring up the fact that much of what he writes about, even describes, sounds like almost direct quotes from aspects of Reich's work from the 20s and 30s. But it is an active offshoot of that work and influence. So, that said, beyond that, there is within, I think, the New Age, and I've talked about this before, within what is roughly perceived of as the New Age movement, a great sort of diverse presence of Reich and Reich's ideas. But by that time, by the time you get to that kind of thing, you're really talking about sort of Reich becoming an icon and sort of a mythical kind of figure at best, sometimes a justification for all sorts of wrong ideas about what Reich was about, but nonetheless, sort of a pervading presence in the sense of giving a kind of permission to how you work on the body, how important the body is as and life function is as the way it affects a whole system in the world. So now, what I haven't addressed, and should probably come up in questioning, hopefully, is, is orgonomy a preferable or better, if one wants to ask that kind of question, clinical model than any of these others? Now, I can answer that personally by saying, obviously, I've given my life to working in this, and obviously, I think it is. But one could make various arguments. I think the key issue here is that what orgonomy presents to me, certainly as a scholar, rather than just as a clinician, is that it's comprehensive. It's an attempt to integrate and extract and conceive of the goals as something that are consistent with the nature of life function. That means that if one follows it consistently, that there is a consistency to it, right? As opposed to what I find in most of these other models, which I have studied pretty actively and not just superficially, a great deal of chaos and a great deal of confusion as to where the center is, where you come at them from, and how you even do treatment. The result is that most practitioners in most of these other models tend to vary widely in how they practice. Now, whereas the difference between, there might be a lot of personal differences and social and petty differences between various groups of ergonomists, but anyone who's trained ergonomically in a serious ergonomic training basically shares a pretty consistent view of how and what you do when you do clinical practice. And I think that is very, very consistent and very important. Part of the problem with all of this is that we have no, and Dr. Rothenberg, you remember talking about the cancer work, it's always the same problem. We have no consistent long-term database, to see which of these therapies works best for this and how they stack up against each other. And my goal here really was not to try to make an argument for ergonomy versus, or in the sense that maybe it was unfortunate to even use that in the title, but it's not so much to make a case for ergonomy being preferable to any of these others as much as to understand that ergonomy is a unique kind of practice and that it's different, so that when someone says to you, oh, I'm a Reichian therapist, or I'm in Reichian therapy, or I'm interested in Reichian therapy, they're not necessarily talking about ergonomy. And I think that, if anything, was my hope in sort of at least getting on record that kind of clarity. As such, I hope I did.
You didn't mention Esalen.
Well, I guess I should have. Esalen, I guess it's been there for so long. Esalen, you all know Esalen? Is Esalen a household word? It used to be in the 60s. See, all these old guys, I guess we all know.
It's still there.
I know, it's still there. It's actually quite beautiful. Esalen was the 1960s sort of answer to Fritz Perls and a number of the more radical, Eric Fromm, Fritz Perls, and in California they bought a huge estate up on overlooking the Pacific down in Big Sur, and they began to do the work with experiential group therapies and self-actualization, and largely Gestalt. Perls was in residence there for a long time. And again, there was the sort of the hot tub period of, and I don't have much to say. I think what Esalen was largely was a big sort of community in which many different ideas were tried. I don't think the Esalen approach had any particular, other than possibly Gestalt, had no real particular overall philosophy as much as drawing in anybody who had any radical ideas about how to do work with human self-actualization and such. And was probably okay. Did a lot of couples work, a lot of self-realization work and visualization work, and all sorts of various kinds of self-healing models, and it still does. And so, in that sense, it's probably the grandmother or grandfather of sort of the New Age, but pretty low key compared to a lot of, and not very mystical in the more active, mystical, spiritual New Age model. But I wouldn't think of it so much as a clinical model as sort of a setting.
I think that's where, from people I know, I think that's where a great deal of the influence of Reich, or the ideas of Reich, got spread diffusely through the psychological, the psychotherapeutic.
I think particularly at Esalen had a major impact in the thinking of many intellectuals and writers and artists and film people and culturally active people with a lot of access to public opinion in the culture. I think it had a major impact there. Someone should really look at that. Not to mention the fact is that this beautiful set. I mean, if anyone ever been out to Esalen, it's a Big Sur. It's really spectacular.
Big Sur.
And what Esalen is right there. It's right on the cliffs. It's really, and that's not to be toyed with. I mean, Reich was very clear that physical setting. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, Reich, and I run into this constantly. Many of my patients will often talk about the fact that doing therapy in an enclosed space that's surrounded by New York City and sealed off as best you can is very different than doing treatment in nature. And that's not to be dismissed, but we can't always do that. But I think the other big thing is the problem of what happens and that was the last note I had made, actually, is to just sort of finish on, is what happens if you remove, which is what all of the Reichian therapies do pretty much, if you remove the orgasm formula, or orgastic potency as the goal, or this pulsation as the goal of the clinical model, what do you get? Well, Reich was very clear on that in saying what you would get without that is essentially anything you want, because at that point you could go in any, you could go off in any direction and create anything because you did not have a physically based center. What the orgasm formula presents is an anchor. That's what the nature and center of function is. Once you don't have that, well, you could be out here, you could be over here, you could work on this part of the body, you could work on this, you could work on social behavior. Then it becomes anything is possible, and any goal that you set is, workable or reasonable. Yeah.
And one thing that strikes me very strongly is that Reich was painfully meticulous about giving credit to sources and conducting research in such a way that it was unquestionable and trying to, whereas almost without exception, every one of the founders of every one of these other things is a liar.
Right.
So I think that has to weigh heavily on any judgment that one makes.
My reason for always making these
Basically, Hyde is
my reason for making these public statements when I'm in situations to lecture is just at least that the record be straight that these were and these are not truthful in the presentation. What that means about the practice, remains to be seen. Certainly, interestingly, in the French tradition, for instance, I'm talking to a French friend, analyst, saying, actually a scholar, in France, we never cite references. You never cite references. You read Lacan, he almost never refers to where he takes anything from. You read almost any of the French, Sartre never tells where he gets anything from.
But he was a psychotic.
Yeah, well, whatever. So I guess I don't know whether that's it's just that there are traditions where that is not assumed. Reich was meticulous, and the reason being that he wanted it very, very clear, and he was always very careful to try to be very clear about what it was he contributed and what he didn't, because he knew, I think, very clearly that he was open to misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and at least he wanted on the record there to be as much information and as much knowledge about what he actually said and did as possible. But nonetheless, it still gets distorted.
There's incredible honesty.
Let's see if there are any other questions?
What about Dianetics?
Oh, yeah, right. Actually, that's interesting that I ignored. L. Ron Hubbard, of course, very strongly in the 50s and 60s tapped into Reich, but I can't, basically, L. Ron Hubbard essentially picked up and learned very clearly, as far as I would say, the value of mass psychology as a manipulative movement, and he learned a great deal from Reich, and the rest is history. It's hard, that's a whole other subject, which they have many documentaries on. Clearly, Hubbard was a, brilliant psychopath, able to manipulate and direct and control, very mystical, and was very perceptive. Usually my own response to that is to say that Mein Kampf is one of the greatest documents of 20th century literature. Hitler was, most people don't read it because they're very embarrassed by it. As Reich used to say, most people don't want to carry, he got arrested for coming into this country with a copy of Mein Kampf. They didn't care that he came in with Marx and and Lenin and and others. But Mein Kampf was a Nazi document. What was he coming into this country? He must be a German spy. Plus, he spoke German. That was proved. And he kept saying, "I'm writing about this. How do I write about it if I don't read it?" But the fact is, most people don't read Mein Kampf, like L. Ron Hubbard's works, are brilliant. Hitler was absolutely astoundingly perceptive. He understood character analysis better than, and he understood mass psychology as well as Reich, which is very different than Reich. He didn't read Reich, but obviously he had picked up on the same body of knowledge I think, and was able to use it. And I think Hubbard does that too. He's understood how to organize and market a mass movement around many of these same principles, and he's mystified it to a point where it's a whole other kind of, and I think rightfully so, in his own way, had the sense, smart and shrewdness, but also I think in a funny way, the rightness in deciding it was a religion.
Can I tell you 20 moments?
Yeah, but let's just see some other questions.
Is L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that time it was called Dianetics,
It
and then it
became
became
church.
Scientology.
I'd like you to comment on Rolfing, and the other thing is chiropractic, where they talk about subluxation.
Subluxations I don't know too much about. Rolfing, Ida Rolf was a chemist in Europe, attended a number of Reich's lectures, as she says, was influenced by that, and began to develop completely on her own, and to my knowledge, with no involvement with Reich after that, a technique of deep, extremely aggressive massage, working on the muscles and bone structure and fascia, and that could produce a great deal, at least by all accounts, a great deal of physical release and of tension and relaxation and possible correction of long-term chronic structural holding patterns. I'm not an expert, Ralph. In my general experience, it's a very limited practice, potentially dangerous in the hands of people who don't know, who aren't really actively trained. Many patients I've known or seen come to me after having been through an active Rolfing, usually in very bad shape, can be easily hurt, and also emotionally very disrupted. It's not, in my understanding, Ida Rolf did not propose it as an active, aggressive, total clinical model of therapy. It was essentially as a form of active and deep massage. It's been elevated much more to a therapeutic stage. It certainly does not have in any of my readings, and I don't keep up with the latest writings by students of hers and clinical work. It does not have in any way the same kind of central principles that ergonomy does as its goal. That's about as much as I can say. As far as chiropractic, chiropractic, does what it does. There are various forms of chiropractic. I can't keep up with all the various aspects. Periodically you get different kinds of chiropractic work. The big area being the sacral, cranial sacral work now. Again, all of it is much the same, which you learn as we do that you can work on all sorts of aspects of the body and get reactions, get results in various ways. But the issue is for what purpose, to what avail. Similarly, the other area that Dr. Sobey's last letter that he and I wrote together to New York Magazine and a number of other magazines was the development of this eye movement therapy that's been becoming big and very active today, where this woman came up with this idea that if you get people's eyes moving rapidly, you can bring about emotional discharge and correction of deep emotional psychiatric disorders. It's become very, very big, and it has a lot of money behind it, and grants behind it, and it's becoming a major form of training. And much of what she presents is really stuff that we were working with back, that Reich was working with back into the 30s already, in terms of working on the eyes, the ocular segment. We didn't get into the segmental nature of the arm ring, because that's more of a clinical detail. But these are things that we know. Reich would say always, look, these are all techniques. Adjustment, working on the eyes, doing this, doing that, Rolfing, all. The question I'll end with in relation to that is to say, Reich would always say when these things were presented, as Dr. Sobey said in our seminars, does it establish the orgasm reflex? If it doesn't, if it makes you feel good, fine. Reich was all in favor of going to the movies. He thought the movies were a wonderful thing. You could go and you could cry and you could laugh, and it was good. It made you feel better, and it helped move energy. It's great. But the basic question was, for Reich always, does it, in terms of clinical importance, does it establish the orgasm reflex?
Well, I think one thing that could be added to that is like there's a lot of things that could cause expansion and make a person feel really good.
Yeah.
Drugs are even an example.
Right,
of that.
absolutely, right,
But-
built into that
But the
too.
problem then is that if they create this wonderful expansion, oftentimes it's followed by a contraction
Right.
that's even worse.
You can't carry.
To reestablish, again, coming back to what Reich says, it's not just about the organ, it's to reestablish the organism's ability to maintain effectively the ability to expand and contract. So that, again, you're absolutely right, to get expansions, or to even get extremely uplifting experiences happening and going are not so difficult. The issue is, how do you get the organism capable of tolerating this kind of process without the reverse, contraction? The key thing is, often contraction is seen as the villain. Wright points out that expansion and contraction are absolutely necessary principles. I mean, they're necessary parts of the same function. So what you want is an organism not only that is capable of expansion, but is also capable of tolerating and experiencing the contraction without panic, without various kinds of psychiatric distress, like depression, anxiety disorders, other kinds of things that can, or various other kinds of psychiatric disorders. So the issue is, and I think that's a very, very good point. There are all sorts of, in a sense, that's what happens when you abandon the orgasm thing. That's great. That's the real answer. The answer is you abandon the orgasm formula, then what you're left with is all sorts of ways of getting results, getting effects, but not a central way of understanding what the organizing function is and what the anchor is and what it is and how it translates into effective function in the living individual.
Of course, when the organism expands and doesn't contract, it goes into a manic phase.
Or there's so many varieties. The point again is what you learn in doing this kind of work or being involved in this kind of work is that every time you think you've seen one thing, there's another thing that because once these processes are set going, it's the idea of water being dammed up and flowing. Once there's a floodplain, you can't predict where or how exactly it's going to go unless you understand exactly, the soil pattern. I'm sure you work in soil fertility and other. I mean, you can understand flood basins and patterns and probably predict to some degree, but there's a great deal that you can't predict in these ways. And so, right. Or stresses in buildings or things of such.
In the spirit of the way that modern, contemporary, let's say, brain science or psychiatry seems to be going, do you know whether anyone is, let's say, in using biochemistry or the new kinds of scans, where they can see different parts of the brain sort of lighting up in different colors and so on, using that as a way of, and then going back to something like Reich's work or psychoanalysis or any of the other types.
No one I know
saying, this is why those things are happening.
No one I know is doing it in an experimental context in terms of the new technology. They're certainly based on my readings and my examination of a lot of the data based on the use of heat sensors in terms of body movement, looking at the structure of the body through heat readings, and actually a number of acupuncture groups had done attempts to read the body, scan the body thermally on computers when working with various acupuncture points and stuff. And it's clear that what this demonstrates is that there are clear energetic temperature changes and movements in the body. And I've always read all of the literature in all the sciences as ways of seeing how you can use it. Since we don't have our own laboratories, I think it's one of the values of anybody working with any interest in this from any direction, whether it's in the science, for instance, Mark, who works in environmental science, and say, when you read that literature, even though they're not talking about this, see what there is there that would in some way, relate to things that Reich was addressing and talking about. And I think there's a great deal going on in brain research and brain study that I think has lends very strong support to a lot of what Reich was at least proposing. Reich, by the way, always felt that what orgonomy, if it was allowed to thrive and function and evolve, would look like, in 100 years, would be nothing like what he had no desire for it to become. Actually, quite different than Freud. If you look at Freud's last writings, the end of Freud's life was spent in building an absolute dogmatic frame of saying, this is psychoanalysis as it must be. And anyone who deviates from this is not a psychoanalyst, or is not psychoanalytic. Reich, on the other hand, really maintained very actively the idea that this is just a starting point. And his great regret to the very end was that he didn't have a chance to do more and build broader-based areas for laboratory study, that it was all too centered on him and not on a lot of other people. And I think that, so I think what we can use until something better comes along is an attempt to look at what is generated by mechanistic science, by mainstream science, as ways of beginning to see what interconnects with some of the things that Reich set in motion.
There's a thing with the brain science studies.
I don't know if that really probably doesn't, but I don't really know how much to say because there isn't. But that's a good project for you.
They're all predicated upon the brain as a controlling agent, which is not necessarily scientifically correct thing.
Well, the brain clearly is a controlling agent as long as if that's all you're looking at. Anyone is a fool to read that material and not say that it's absolutely true. They can describe in great detail how the brain works and what does what. That doesn't contradict anything that Reich was talking about. The question is what unifies it, what. And the interesting thing, even when we talk about in astrophysics, the need for, or in particular physics, the need for a unifying force that presents itself in neurosciences, or even in the biological sciences, and in the certainly in the psychiatric sciences, brain science. There is increasingly, if you read the literature, a great deal of frustration in that they understand all the results of these chemicals and various hormonal interactions and physical, physiological, anatomical, and cellular, molecular, biological reactions, but they can't really explain why or how it all comes about, or how it all, is organized in terms of the whole. They can do it in terms of particulars, but how the whole, or why, or how it comes out to be.
What controls the brain?
Yeah,
What controls the brain?
Not only that, what the point of the brain is. So you get interesting speculations. If you read the work of Sir Francis Crick, the guy who discovered DNA, most people don't understand what he spent his since the discovery of DNA, right? The double helix. Does anyone know what Crick has been doing? What his primary
The astonishing hypothesis. Did you write that book?
Yeah, but more significantly, he spent most of his time doing brain research.
Right.
Yeah. But the astonishing hypothesis is more of his speculations than again. But what he's led to is what Crick's point is that everything that we're doing here is a result that we have brains that produce too much excess electrical charge. So that most consciousness and most of social interaction is just a way of discharging and distracting us while we perform our primary purpose, which is what?
Procreation.
Yeah, but procreation is only a means to an end. It's so that the DNA gets transferred. We're vehicles for the transferring DNA. Now, what Crick is about, when you read him, I haven't read the Astonishing Cosmos, but it's the most recent more attempt to do a bestseller based on this stuff. But in the articles I've read, what he's approaching is that finally he gets all this information on the intricacies of the working of this structure, but they can't explain. There isn't inherent in that information what it is that unifies it or organizes it, or what its purpose is, or what its natural function is, other than, in other words, they can describe the function in detail, but they can't offer. So then, at that point, you offer any, and you come up with any. Well, it's mystical. You come up with any kind of explanation. It's what I call the moon is made of green cheese theory, which is it works. You don't need, unless you're going to go on the moon and you say we don't have to bring any food because we have a lot of cheese up there, then you got a problem. But it isn't inherently, any number of theories are possible. And for many generations, the idea that, the sun came up in the morning because Festus put his chariot, and went across the sky, worked. The fields of Greece, were productive. People got out there and they did their jobs. They didn't need to know anything other than that. I mean, again, so theories, people got born, it's only been in the last 200 years that, generally speaking, the concept of what gestation is and how babies get born has never really been known or used.
200 years old?
Yeah, in terms of the medical understanding of fetal development and sperm and egg. There are whole societies, I always point out to my students in anthropology, there are societies that operate on the premise that one cannot have a baby until one marries the ghost of a departed ancestor, the appropriate ghost of a departed ancestor. Now these girls are having sex with available men all the time, and yet they don't have babies until they go through a ritual marriage.
How do you account for that?
I know. They will tell you that that's the way it happens.
So mind over matter, huh?
Also, but nonetheless, the society encourages active sexual liaison. So sex is not prohibited. It's just sex is not how babies get born, as far as they're concerned. But it's fine. It works. That's what I'm saying. So that's a similar kind of principle here. You can have a huge amount of knowledge, but until you understand the unifying principles, the knowledge then becomes just, interesting. Any other questions? Or responses?
I mentioned that.
Jim has a question.
No, the question is a response. I'm struck continually about that. So it comes down to the character of the practitioner.
Well, in terms of doing work, yeah, but that's true. I think in any. I mean, that's true for trained ergonomists too.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's simply a matter of us versus them. I mean, I just think, but that yes, certainly. And if Reich has made any general contribution to understanding of human behavior, is that character structure is a amazingly both resilient and amazingly effective means of social cohesion and survival, but it's also at times an extremely difficult and problematic, barrier to effective interaction. I guess we should really, unless you have any more pressing issues, summer out. And anyone who hasn't paid me can pay me. Gladly pay you 2 days.
Today, yeah.